The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, Lord.
When Judas had gone, Jesus said, "Now has the Son of Man been glorified, and in him God has been glorified. If God has been glorified in him, God will in turn glorify him in himself and will glorify him very soon. My little children, I shall not be with you much longer. I give you a new commandment: love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also must love one another. By this love you have for one another, everyone will know that you are my disciples." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Over the last few Sundays, we've been following the same pattern of readings. So we've had a passage from the Acts of the Apostles, and then we've had a bit from the Apocalypse, and finally a bit of St. John's Gospel. Last Sunday and today, we've had in the Acts a bit about St. Paul's first missionary journey. Then today, we've had a bit from the Apocalypse, much further on from the last couple of Sundays, towards the end in chapter 21. And here we have a wonderful image of God living with us. In fact, it's not a perfect translation, although it's quite nice English and easy to remember. But it says, God lives among men. But in fact, what the Greek says, it's he's pitched his tent with us. So that doesn't mean we're supposed to think of Glastonbury Festival and things like that. That's the way God lives with us. Probably getting rather muddy too. That's not quite it. So what we have to do to understand this image of pitching his tent with us is to go back to the Old Testament and see how that phrase is used there. We need to understand Moses. We can't underestimate the importance of Moses in understanding Jesus. So, do you remember Moses God through Moses set the Hebrew slaves free, brought them through the Red Sea, which was parted, and then took them wandering through the wilderness. Moses went up Mount Sinai, and there God gave him the 10 Commandments. When he brought them down from Mount Sinai, God instructed him eventually to put them in the Ark of the Covenant. And this was a box made of acacia wood, covered in gold leaf, with angels on the top, statues of angels. And this was kept in a tent in the wilderness. And they kept bringing the tent with them wherever they stopped. And so the priest would go in there, which was Aaron, Moses' brother, and they would offer sacrifice to God. So God's presence was marked through the ark, but inside the tent. So we have some idea of the tent being there, God's presence marked by it. When we come to the New Testament, we find something very interesting. You know, when we say the Angelus, lovely old prayer, and it's got 3 responses, and the third response is, "And the Word was made flesh," and we say, "And he dwelt amongst us." And he dwelt amongst us, that's based on the Latin translation, et habitavit in nobis. But the Greek there, at the beginning of John's Gospel, in the prologue, actually says, he pitched his tent amongst us. So this idea of God dwelling within us is actually saying he's establishing himself in a way that he did throughout the Old Testament with the ark. So we have these curtains around, as it were, this image of the presence of God in the ark. And then God wanted to dwell with us. He pitched his tents among us. It goes on a bit further, actually, because if we know a little bit of classical Greek, in fact, skene, which means tent, also means the stage for a play. And so here we have this image, not only of God dwelling within us, but he's acting out the drama of the incarnation, God becoming man, by saying we use this tent. So it's like the whole stage of a play. God is living that out, performing a drama in front of his people. So really getting involved with them, and they're interacting with him. So it's a wonderful image that we find in the New Testament, the idea of pitching his tent. We move on then to the Gospel of John. John is we can divide it into two sections. The first part deals with Jesus' public ministry, particularly the first 7 days. And then when we get to chapter 13, which is where we read from today, we're dealing with the Last Supper, then the Passion and the Resurrection. So we're a little bit into chapter 13 here. Just before this was Judas, right? And Jesus washing the disciples' feet. And Jesus tells Judas, go and do what you have to do. And Judas leaves, and we're told very poignantly, it was night. It was dark. That's quite a theme in John's Gospel, light and dark. We find it in the prologue right at the very beginning. Jesus is the light, and where Jesus is not, where he's not present, or where the devil takes over, it's darkness. Now Jesus says, after Jesus is gone, that the Son of Man has been glorified. So the beginning of his glory has already started with the beginnings of the Passion. So what is this idea of glory? We can think of ordinary ways in which we might use glory, usually associated with sort of military endeavours and, winning a battle or something like that, and that's glorious. But this doesn't really help us in understanding what glory means when we're thinking about God. Again, we have to turn our pages back on our Bible and look at Moses. Also, going up Mount Sinai, do you remember when he came down? His face was shining so brightly because he'd been in contact and talking directly with God. And the people were afraid of this, and they said, no, cover your face. And every time he went into the tent of meeting, where they kept the ark, he spoke face to face with God, and he came out and his face was shining so brightly that the people said, no, cover your face, because it's reflecting the glory of God. So there's something that we see here in reflecting the majesty of God, his awesome power, the light that shines from him. We also see it in thunder and lightning, loud voices, and in the cloud. All these are ideas of the glory of the Lord. But then as we read further through the Old Testament, we find the glory of the Lord, particularly with Elijah, is not so much in the thunder and lightning, but in the still, small, calm voice of the wind, a gentle breeze. And that's when Elijah knew that this was the Lord, the Holy One, who was passing. So this idea of glory in the Old Testament is filled, yes, with the majesty of God, the awesomeness of God, the one who is all holy, all set apart from the world that he's created. But then we find this idea developed in the New Testament as well. Jesus shows his glory. The first time we find that is in his first miracle, which is the marriage of Cana, when he changes water into wine. And at the end of that passage it says, and he let his glory be seen. So his glory wasn't a face shining like Moses' face was reflecting the glory of God. No, he was showing his divinity because he showed his power over nature, changing water into wine. So the idea of glory in the New Testament and Old Testament is all about seeing God revealing himself, his godliness, his divinity. John's Gospel heads towards what we call the hour of Jesus, or what he called himself, his hour, and his hour of glory when he would be glorified. In the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, the glory tends to be just focused on the resurrection as well as the transfiguration. But in John, the whole of the Passion is a revelation of God's glory. And this is why he says in chapter 13, just after Judas has gone, that he has been glorified, because the beginning of the Passion has started. Well, why is that? It's because Jesus actually says to Judas, you can go now. He sends him off. The other disciples didn't know why. Jesus knew why. He was going off to betray Jesus. They needed a betrayer because it was dark and they didn't have torches and things, so they needed someone who was reliable, who could identify Jesus clearly to arrest him in the agony in the garden in Gethsemane. So Jesus is in control, totally in control of his passion, his destiny, which is to accomplish the will of his Father, offering his own life in sacrifice for our sins. The whole Passion is this revelation of God's glory. What's interesting then, Jesus goes on from talking about his glory and the glory that will be his in offering his own life, in being sacrificed on the cross, and then straight away giving us a new commandment. We're all familiar with that text perhaps. A new commandment I give you, to love one another just as I have loved you. So somehow there's a connection between God's glory, Jesus' glory in suffering on the cross, and our love. And it's precisely in love that in fact we see that we're made in God's image and likeness. And in loving, we're becoming more godlike. If you turn our pages right back in our Bible to the book of Genesis, what do we read there in chapter 3? God created man and woman. In his own image he created them. So what is this image of God? Well, the image of God, most especially that we see, is love. That he is lovable, that he is loving, that the life of the Trinity itself is of self-giving and allowing the other to give. And he's saying the same to us. If you really want to show up this spark of godliness in you, then we need to love, to be true lovers, not just in the romantic sense, but in the true sense of love, of self-giving and allowing the other to give as well. So then we receive love, that we know that we're lovable. And that way we become truly human. We live out our humanity by being true lovers. It's quite interesting on the radio this morning, local radio, they were talking about people who've made people happy in the country, 100 people who've made people happy. And all of that focus, it was very interesting to see, was all about self-giving, about charity, about love. And so even in a secular world, there's a recognition that really what we like to see and what makes us deeply happy, what keeps our heart beating, is to know that we're loved and to love ourselves as well, to be lovers in that wonderful, broader sense, a proper sense of agape, of love. So we're called then, in love, in becoming more godlike, then we reflect the glory of God. And as it says in the letter to the Hebrews, with unveiled faces. We don't have to be like Moses, having to veil our face. We reflect the glory of God in being more like him as being true lovers. So today we've got wonderful images. God pitching his tent amongst us, wanting to get stuck into our life, wanting to be with us and acting out the drama of the incarnation and revealing his wonderful glory to us, the glory of his divinity.